What if the life you're living right now looks fine on the outside, but inside, you feel stuck, unheard, and slowly giving up on love, on connection? Even on yourself? I took a risk that could have broken everything or saved it. In this real story, you'll see how one honest moment changed my marriage, my voice, and everything I thought I knew. Would you risk it too? I took the risk. You smile, you nod, you say, I'm okay, but deep down you know you're slowly disconnecting. Not just from others, but from yourself. That was me, right here in the United States, in a life that looked stable, safe, even enviable. But something wasn't right. And the scariest part? I almost chose to ignore it forever. You know that strange moment when everything is technically good, yet your chest feels heavy for no clear reason? Psychologists actually have a name for this. It's called emotional dissonance. Your outer life and your inner feelings don't match. And your brain hates that mismatch. So what does it do? It tries to protect you by telling you, just stay quiet. Don't risk it. Don't ruin what you already have. That voice? It sounds logical, responsible, mature even. But sometimes it's also the reason you stay stuck. In my case, the problem didn't explode overnight. It didn't come with drama or shouting or some cinematic breakup scene.
No, it was quieter than that.
More dangerous. It showed up in small things. Conversations that became shorter. Eye contact that lasted just a little less. Moments that used to feel warm suddenly felt neutral. Like drinking coffee that used to be your favorite, but now just tastes like hot water. And here's the twist. You might not notice it at first. Because life in the U.S. moves fast. Work, responsibilities, routines. You get really good at functioning. You show up. You do what needs to be done. And from the outside, you look like someone who has it all together. But inside, you're slowly drifting. I remember one evening so clearly. It wasn't special. No big event.
Just a normal day.
The kind of day that disappears as soon as it ends. We were sitting in the same room, doing completely different things.
No arguments. No tensión.
Just silence. And that silence said everything. That's when it hit me, not like a lightning bolt, but like a quiet realization that creeps in and refuses to leave. If nothing changes, this is it.
No explosión. No ending.
Just a slow, comfortable distance that becomes permanent. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because at that moment, I had a choice. Not a dramatic, movie-style decision.
No.
This was much harder. It was invisible, internal, the kind of choice no one else sees. The kind where you either tell the truth or you keep pretending. Most people choose pretending. And honestly, I get it. Because telling the truth, especially in a relationship, especially in a life you've already built, is terrifying. Your brain immediately starts listing all the risks. What if you make things worse? What if you regret it? What if you lose everything? So you stay quiet. You adapt. You shrink. And over time, something inside you slowly fades. There's actually research from neuroscience that explains this. When you repeatedly suppress what you feel or want to say, your brain starts reinforcing avoidance pathways. Basically, the more you stay silent, the easier it becomes to keep staying silent. It becomes your default setting. Comfortable, but costly. That's where I was. Living a life that worked, but didn't feel alive. And here's the part one didn't expect. It wasn't just affecting my emotions. It was affecting how I communicated, how I expressed myself, even in simple English conversations. Not because I didn't know the words, but because I stopped trusting my own voice. Think about that for a second. You don't lose your voice all at once. You lose it slowly every time you decide it's safer not to use it. So one day, I asked myself a question that I had been avoiding for months. If nothing changes, will I be okay with this life 5 years from now? And the answer came faster than I expected.
No.
Not angry, not dramatic, just clear. And clarity can be terrifying. Because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. That's when the real tension begins. Not between you and someone else, but inside you. One part of you wants safety. The other wants honesty. One says, stay where you are. The other whispers, this isn't enough. And here's the thing nobody tells you. Growth doesn't start with confidence. It starts with discomfort. So I sat there, in that quiet room, realizing that the biggest risk wasn't speaking up. The biggest risk was staying silent. But knowing that doesn't magically make it easier. Fear doesn't disappear just because you understand it. In fact, sometimes it gets louder. Your mind starts playing worst-case scenarios like a movie you didn't ask to watch. And yet, there was another thought. Softer but persistent. What if this risk is the only way forward? Not to destroy what I had, but to save it. That idea changed everything. Because suddenly, the risk wasn't just about loss. It was about possibility. Now, let's be real for a second. Taking a risk in real life, especially in relationships, especially in a culture where independence and communication are highly valued like in the U.S., isn't about making big dramatic moves. It's about small, honest moments. It's about saying one sentence you've been holding back. Just one. And that's exactly where my story begins. Not with a perfect plan, not with confidence, but with a simple, uncomfortable decision. To stop pretending. To say something real.
To take the risk.
And here's the question I want you to sit with. Not later, not someday, but right now. If your life feels fine but not fulfilling, if your relationship feels stable but distant, if your voice has been quiet for too long, would you risk
it?
Or would you keep living a life that looks okay but never truly feels like yours? Because what I'm about to share next started with one small moment.
And it changed everything.
A quiet struggle. Have you ever tried to explain how you feel and then stopped halfway, not because you didn't have the words, but because you weren't sure they would land the way you meant them to? That strange hesitation, that split second where your brain says, maybe just let it go. That became my daily habit. And the scary part? It looked like peace from the outside. Life kept moving. Work, meals, small talk, routines. If someone had filmed my day and posted it online, it would probably look calm, even ideal. A normal life in the United States.
No chaos. No visible cracks.
But here's the uncomfortable truth. Not all struggles are loud. Some of the hardest ones are completely silent. And silence is very good at pretending to be stability. There's something about modern life in the U.S. that people don't always talk about. Everything is efficient. Conversations are quick. People respect space, independence, personal boundaries. On paper, it's healthy. And it is. But if you're already feeling disconnected, that same space can quietly turn into distance. No one interrupts you, but no one pulls you closer either. So you float somewhere in between, functioning, polite, but emotionally slightly out of reach. That's exactly where I found myself. I started noticing patterns. Small ones. Easy to ignore. Conversations that stayed on the surface. How was your day? Good. What about you? Busy. And that was it. No follow-up.
No curiosity.
Just efficient communication. And here's the twist. This is actually very common. Research in relationship psychology shows that couples don't usually break because of big conflicts. They drift apart because of what experts call micro-disconnections. Tiny moments where connection could happen but doesn't. A missed question. A half-listened answer. A feeling left unspoken. Individually, they mean nothing. But over time, they stack up, like invisible distance. I remember one night, standing in the kitchen, holding my phone, rereading a simple message I was about to send. It wasn't dramatic, just a sentence. Honest but gentle. Something like, I feel like we haven't really talked in a while. And I didn't send it, not because it was wrong, but because I wasn't sure what would happen next. That hesitation, that's where the quiet struggle lives. Your brain starts negotiating with itself. It's not a big deal. Maybe I'm overthinking. Now is not the right time. And just like that, the moment passes. Multiply that by days, weeks, months, and suddenly, silence becomes your communication style. Here's something fascinating. The human brain is wired to avoid social risk almost as strongly as physical danger. Studies show that rejection activates the same pain centers as physical injury. So when you hesitate to speak honestly, your brain isn't being weak, it's being protective. But protection has a cost. Because every time you choose comfort over honesty, you reinforce a pattern, and patterns become identity. You start seeing yourself as the quiet one, the easy one, the one who doesn't make things complicated. Sounds nice, right? Until you realize you've disappeared inside your own life. That was the part that hit me the hardest. Not anger, not sadness, just a quiet realization. I'm here, but not fully here. And it didn't just affect my relationship. It started affecting how I showed up everywhere. Even in simple conversations, even in English, which I had worked so hard to improve, I found myself choosing safer words, shorter sentences, less expression. Not because I didn't know how to speak, but because I stopped wanting to risk being misunderstood.
Think about that.
Language isn't just vocabulary. It's courage. It's emotion. It's presence. And when you start holding back emotionally, your communication naturally shrinks with it. That's why some people feel like they can't speak English fluently, even after years of learning. It's not always about grammar. Sometimes it's about fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of being judged. Fear of not being enough. And that fear? It doesn't just live in language. It lives in life. One evening, I noticed something subtle but powerful. We were having dinner, sitting across from each other, and everything looked normal. But internally, I felt like I was watching my own life from a distance. Like I was present but not participating. That's when a strange question popped into my mind. When did I stop being fully myself here? Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Just gradually. And here's the uncomfortable part. There wasn't a clear moment to blame. No single mistake. No obvious turning point. Just a series of small choices to stay quiet, to avoid discomfort, to keep things easy. This is how disconnection really happens. Not through conflict, but through avoidance. And the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to reverse. Because now, it's not just about saying one honest sentence. It's about breaking a pattern your brain has been practicing for months. That's why so many people stay stuck. Not because they don't want change, but because the path back to honesty feels unfamiliar. And humans don't like unfamiliar. We like predictable, even if it's not fulfilling. So there I was, living in a life that worked, but didn't feel right. Speaking less than I wanted. Feeling more than I expressed. Smiling more than I meant. And the quiet struggle continued until something unexpected happened. Not a big event. Not a dramatic argument. Just a moment. A small, almost insignificant moment that made everything impossible to ignore. Because sometimes it's not the loud moments that change your life. It's the quiet ones you almost miss. And what happened next? It forced me to face a truth I had been avoiding for far too long. A chance meeting. Most life-changing moments don't look important when they happen. No dramatic music. No slow motion. Just an ordinary day, quietly turning into something you didn't plan for. That's exactly how it started. It was a typical afternoon. The kind you don't remember because nothing special is supposed to happen. I was out, going through a routine that felt almost automatic, like my body knew where to go, even if my mind wasn't fully there. You know that feeling? When you're physically present, but mentally somewhere else. That had become my normal. And then something small shifted. I was standing in line, half scrolling on my phone, half thinking about nothing in particular, when I heard a voice next to me.
Calm.
Friendly. Casual. Hey, is this line always this low? Simple question. Nothing special. But for some reason it caught me off guard. Not because I didn't understand it. My English was fine. I knew exactly what they said. But my brain did that thing again, that split-second hesitation. The internal pause where you decide, respond or stay safe. And usually, I stayed safe. Short answers. Minimal engagement. No risk. But this time something felt different. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the timing. Or maybe I was just tired of hearing my own silence. So I answered, yeah, I think so. It's always like this in the afternoon. Not perfect. Not impressive. But real. And that's where something unexpected happened. Instead of the conversation ending there, as it usually does in quick, polite interactions in the US, they stayed. Not physically closer, but emotionally present. Good to know. I almost thought I picked the worst time, they said, smiling slightly. And just like that, the conversation continued. Now, if you've lived in the U.S. or interacted with American culture, you know this moment can go either way. Sometimes people are friendly, but only briefly. Small talk is common, but depth? That's optional. So, I expected the usual pattern. A few polite exchanges. Then silence. But this didn't follow the pattern. The conversation kept going. Not deep. Not personal. Just natural. And here's the part that surprised me the most. It didn't feel exhausting. Usually when I spoke more than necessary, especially in English, my brain would go into overdrive.
Monitoring grammar.
Choosing words carefully. Avoiding mistakes. It felt like juggling while walking on a tightrope. But this time, it felt light. There's actually a psychological explanation for this. When you feel emotionally safe, even in a small interaction, your brain reduces what's called cognitive load. In simple terms, you stop overthinking. You stop analyzing every word. You just communicate. And that changes everything. Because suddenly, language isn't a test. It's a connection. We talked about random things. The line. The weather. How unpredictable schedules can be. Nothing important. But at the same time, everything felt important. Because for the first time in a while, I wasn't holding back. I wasn't trying to sound perfect. I was just there. Present. And then, something even more unexpected happened. They asked me a question. Not the usual, where are you from? Or what do you do? The standard conversation shortcuts people use when they don't really want to connect. It was different. So, do you like it here? I mean, not just the place. Your life right now. That question? It hit deeper than it should have. Because it wasn't about facts. It was about truth. And for a second, I froze. Not because I didn't understand, but because I didn't know if I was ready to answer honestly. You ever notice how the simplest questions can feel the hardest? Not because they're complicated, but because they don't let you hide. My brain immediately started searching for a safe answer. Something neutral. Something easy. Something that wouldn't open anything up. I mean, yeah, it's good. That was the default. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way they asked. Not curious in a casual way, but attentive. Like they were actually listening before I even spoke. And in that moment, I felt a choice again. The same one I had been avoiding. Stay surface level, or say something real. Now here's where things get interesting. According to behavioral psychology, humans are more likely to change patterns not during big events, but during what's called disruptive micro-moments. Small situations that feel just different enough to break your usual behavior. This was one of those moments. Everything was the same. Same me. Same habits. Same environment. But something felt open. So instead of giving the safe answer, I paused. And then I said something I didn't expect to say. Honestly, I don't know. Simple, but real. And once that door opened, it didn't close. Because they didn't react with confusion or awkwardness. They nodded, like that answer made sense. And suddenly the conversation shifted. Not dramatically. Not emotionally intense. Just more honest. And that's when I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. Connection doesn't start with perfect language. It starts with honesty. Even a small one. Even a simple sentence like, I don't know. That moment didn't change my life instantly. It didn't fix my relationship. It didn't solve my internal struggle. But it did something just as important. It showed me what was possible. That I could speak without overthinking every word. That I could connect without being perfect. That maybe, just maybe, my voice wasn't the problem. Maybe I had just stopped using it. And here's the part one didn't see coming. That one small conversation, it stayed with me. Long after the line moved. Long after we went our separate ways. Because it planted a question in my mind that I couldn't ignore anymore. If I can be this honest with a stranger, why am I still holding back in my own life? That question? That's where everything started to shift. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably. Because sometimes the most important people in your story are the ones who don't stay. They just show you something you were ready to see and leave you with a choice. And now I had one again. Small words, big changes. It's funny how people think change has to be loud to be real. Like it needs a big decision, a dramatic conversation, or some life-altering moment that you can point to and say, that's when everything changed. But in reality, the most powerful changes often start in places so small you almost miss them. For me, it started with a sentence. Not a perfect one. Not even a confident one. Just a slightly more honest one than usual. After that unexpected conversation I told you about, something in my brain didn't go back to normal. You know how habits usually reset overnight? Like you wake up and continue being the same version of yourself? Yeah, that didn't happen. Instead, I became aware of my silence, of my pauses, of all the moments where I almost said something but didn't. And awareness is uncomfortable. Because once you see a pattern, you can't pretend it's not there anymore. So the next time I found myself in a familiar situation, a simple, everyday conversation, I noticed the same internal hesitation rising up again. That little voice saying, keep it short, keep it safe. But this time something else was there too. A second voice. Quieter, but persistent. What if you just say a little more? Not everything. Not something dramatic. Just a little more. So, I tried it. Instead of ending a sentence early, I added one more thought. Instead of saying it's fine, I said, it's fine, but I've been a bit tired lately. Small difference. Huge shift. Because here's what most people don't realize. Communication isn't about big speeches. It's about micro-expansion. Adding one layer deeper than your default. And that's exactly what I started practicing. Not perfectly. Not consistently. But intentionally. There's actually a concept in neuroscience called behavioral shaping. It means you don't change habits by forcing big actions. You change them by reinforcing small ones repeatedly. In other words, you don't become more expressive overnight. You become more expressive one sentence at a time. And something interesting started happening. The more I allowed myself to speak just a little more honestly, the less effort it took. At first, it felt uncomfortable, like wearing new shoes that don't quite fit yet. You're aware of every step, every word, every reaction. But over time, it started to feel natural. Not easy, but possible. And that changed everything. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just participating in conversations. I was actually in them. Present. Engaged.
Real.
Now, let's talk about something important, especially if you're watching this to improve your English. A lot of people believe they need more vocabulary, better grammar, or a perfect accent to communicate effectively. But here's the truth, backed by research and language acquisition. Emotional engagement matters more than technical perfection. When you care about what you're saying, your brain activates different pathways. You remember words better. You respond faster. You sound more natural.
Why?
Because you're not translating. You're expressing. And that's exactly what started happening to me. My English didn't suddenly become advanced, but it became alive. I stopped focusing on sounding correct and started focusing on being understood. That shift? It's everything. Because perfection creates pressure, but connection creates flow. And slowly, that flow started entering other parts of my life. Not dramatically, not in big, obvious ways, but in quiet, consistent ones. I started asking one more question during conversations. I started sharing one more detail about my day. I started reacting more honestly instead of automatically. And here's where it gets interesting. The people around me noticed. Not immediately. Not explicitly.
But subtly.
Conversations lasted longer. Responses felt warmer. Moments felt less mechanical. It was like turning up the volume just enough for the music to become clear. And yet, not everything felt comfortable. Because with more honesty comes more exposure. When you start expressing yourself more, you also start facing something you've been avoiding. The possibility of being misunderstood. And that fear? It doesn't disappear just because you've made progress. In fact, sometimes it gets stronger. Because now you actually care about being heard. There was one moment I remember clearly. I said something slightly more personal than usual. Not too deep. Just real. And the response I got wasn't what I expected. It wasn't negative. But it wasn't fully understanding either. And instantly, that old voice came back.
See?
This is why you don't say too much. That moment right there? That's where most people stop. They try once. It feels uncomfortable. And they retreat back into silence. But here's the difference this time. I didn't stop. Not because I was confident, but because I had already seen what was possible. That one conversation from before, it changed something in me. It showed me that connection exists. That being real works, even if it doesn't work every time. And that's a powerful realization. Because it shifts your mindset from, I need this to go perfectly, to, I'm willing to try again. And that's where real growth happens. Not in success, but in persistence. So I kept going. One sentence at a time. One moment at a time. And slowly something started changing beneath the surface. Not just in how I spoke, but in how I felt. More present. More aware. More of myself. And that's when I realized something important. This wasn't just about communication anymore. It was about identity. Because every time you choose honesty over comfort, expression over silence, you're not just changing your words. You're changing who you are becoming. And that process? It's quiet. It's slow. But it's powerful. Because one day, you look back and realize you're no longer the person who stays silent. You're the person who speaks. And once that shift begins, it doesn't stay small for long. Because the next step, it's bigger. And it's coming. Cultural clashes. Have you ever followed all the right advice and still felt like something was off? Speak clearly. Be honest. Express your feelings. In the United States, those ideas sound simple, almost like rules everyone understands. But here's what no one tells you. Even when you do all of that, culture still shapes how your words are received. And sometimes, it creates friction you didn't see coming. By this point, I had already started changing. Slowly, quietly, but consistently. I was speaking more, sharing more, allowing myself to be seen just a little more than before. It felt like progress. And it was. But progress doesn't mean smooth. Because the moment you step out of your old patterns, you don't just meet a new version of yourself. You also meet the reality of how others respond to that version. And that's where the clash begins. I remember one specific evening. Not dramatic. Not loud. But it stayed with me. I said something honest, simple, clear, direct. The kind of sentence that self-help books and communication experts would probably celebrate. Something like, I feel like we haven't really been connecting lately. In my mind, that was progress. Honest.
Calm.
Open. But the reaction I got wasn't what I expected. There was a pause. A shift in energy. Not anger. Not rejection. But something else. Discomfort. And in that moment, I felt it too. That invisible tension when two people are technically speaking the same language, but not the same emotional language. Because here's the truth about cultural differences in communication, especially in the U.S. Directness is valued. But emotional timing? Context?
Tone?
Those are unspoken rules. And if you miss them, even slightly, your message can land differently than you intended. There's actually research in cross-cultural psychology that explains this. In low-context cultures like the United States, people rely more on explicit communication, clear words, direct meaning. But even within that system, emotional nuance still matters. It's like playing a game where you know the rules but not the rhythm. And I was still learning the rhythm. So when that moment happened, my brain did what it always used to do. It panicked quietly. That didn't go well. Maybe you said too much. Maybe this is why you stayed silent before. And just like that, the old pattern tried to come back. Retreat. Minimize. Disappear again. But something was different this time. Instead of immediately pulling back, I stayed. Not confidently, but consciously. Because I realized something important in that moment. Growth doesn't just happen when things go well. It happens when things feel uncomfortable and you don't run away. So, I paid attention. Not just to what was said, but to what wasn't said. The pauses. The body language. The subtle shift in tone. And here's what I started to understand. The issue wasn't honesty. It was alignment. You can say the right thing at the wrong moment. Or in the wrong way. And it changes everything. That realization hit deeper than I expected. Because up until that point, I thought the solution was simple. Speak more honestly. But now I saw the bigger picture. It's not just about speaking. It's about connecting. And connection requires awareness, not just of yourself, but of the other person too. That's when I started noticing more patterns, not just in my relationship, but in everyday life in the U.S. People value independence. They respect personal space. They don't always say everything they feel, but they expect clarity when it matters. It's a balance. And if you lean too far in one direction, too silent or too intense, you feel it. That's the clash. Not dramatic. but real. And here's the part that made it even more complicated. I wasn't just learning how to communicate in English. I was learning how to communicate in a different cultural system. And that's a completely different challenge. Because language is visible. Culture is invisible. You can study vocabulary, but you have to experience culture. And sometimes that experience comes with mistakes, misunderstandings,
Awkward moments.
and a lot of internal questioning. There were days I felt like I was doing better, and days I felt like I was starting over. But here's something that kept me grounded. Every uncomfortable moment was feedback, not failure. Feedback. That shift in mindset changed everything. Because instead of asking, why did this go wrong? I started asking, what can I understand better? And slowly, patterns became clearer. Timing matters. Tone matters. Listening matters just as much as speaking. And most importantly, connection is a two-way process. You don't force it. You build it. One moment at a time. But let's be honest for a second. Even with all this awareness, all this effort, it still wasn't easy. Because every time I chose to speak honestly, I was still taking a risk. A real one. The risk of being misunderstood. The risk of creating tension. The risk of facing something I wasn't ready to deal with. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes that risk leads to exactly what you fear. More distance. More confusion. More doubt. And that's exactly what started happening next. Not because I was doing something wrong, but because growth isn't linear. It moves forward and then sideways and sometimes backward. And the deeper I went into this process, the more I realized something I wasn't prepared for. Being honest doesn't always bring people closer right away. Sometimes it reveals how far apart you already are. And that realization? That's where things started to get really difficult. Because now the question wasn't just, can I speak honestly? It became, what happens if honesty changes everything? And that's a much bigger risk than staying silent. Because once you open that door, you can't control what comes through it. And what came next? It tested everything I thought I was ready for. Doubts and distance. There's a moment in every real story where things don't just feel hard, they feel uncertain. Not the kind of uncertainty you can fix with effort or optimism. I'm talking about the kind that sits quietly in your chest and asks a question you don't want to answer. What if this isn't working? And the worst part? You don't know if it's temporary or the beginning of the end. That's where I found myself. After everything I told you, the small changes, the honest words, the effort to connect, something unexpected happened. Instead of everything getting better, things got complicated. Not louder, not dramatic, just heavier. You know that feeling when conversations become more careful? When every word feels like it might tip the balance one way or another. That was us. And suddenly, all the progress I thought I was making started to feel fragile. Like it could break at any moment. This is the part most people don't talk about, especially in stories that are supposed to be inspiring. Because we love clean narratives.
You try.
You grow. Everything improves. But real life? It doesn't follow that script. Sometimes, when you start being more honest, you uncover layers that were hidden for a reason. And those layers? They're not always easy to face. I started noticing more distance. Not physical. Emotional. Subtle changes in tone. Shorter responses. Less spontaneity. The kind of shifts you can't prove, but you can feel. And once you feel them, you can't ignore them. That's when doubt begins to grow.
Slowly. Quietly.
Relentlessly. My mind started doing what minds do best, overanalyzing everything. Did I say too much? Did I change too fast? Was it better before, when things were easier? even if they weren't real? And here's the trap. Doubt doesn't just question your situation. It questions you, your choices, your growth, your instincts. And if you're not careful, it pulls you right back into old patterns. Because suddenly, staying silent again feels tempting.
Familiar.
Safe. There's actually a psychological concept called regression under stress. When people feel overwhelmed or uncertain, they tend to return to previous behaviors that once felt safe, even if those behaviors were limiting. In other words, growth isn't a straight line forward. It's a constant negotiation between who you were and who you're trying to become. And in that moment, the old version of me was very convincing.
See?
This is what happens when you push too much. You were fine before. Why risk losing what you have? Those thoughts felt logical, reasonable, even protective. But there was a problem. They were only half true. Yes, things were fine before, but they weren't real. And once you've experienced even a small amount of real connection, going back to surface level feels empty. That's the paradox. You can't unknow what you now understand. So I was stuck in between, too aware to go back, too uncertain to move forward confidently. And that's one of the hardest places to be, because there's no clear answer, no obvious next step, just tension
and time.
I remember one night in particular, the kind of night where everything feels quiet, but your mind is loud. We were in the same space, but emotionally it felt like two separate worlds. And I caught myself thinking something that scared me. What if we're growing in different directions? Not because of conflict, but because of change. That thought, it changes how you see everything. Because now, the question isn't just about communication. It's about compatibility, about timing, about whether growth brings people together or pulls them apart. And there's no easy answer to that. I wish I could tell you I handled it perfectly, that I stayed calm, confident, and clear. But the truth? I struggled. There were moments I wanted to go back to being quiet. Moments I questioned everything. Moments I wondered if taking the risk was a mistake. And that's important to say out loud. Because too many people think that feeling doubt means you're doing something wrong. It doesn't. It means you're in the middle of something real. Something that matters. Something that hasn't resolved yet. And unresolved things? They're uncomfortable. But they're also where transformation happens. Here's something I learned during that time. Distance doesn't always mean disconnection. Sometimes it means adjustment. When dynamics change, when one person starts showing up differently, it takes time for the relationship to rebalance. And during that time, things feel off, uncertain, even fragile. But fragile doesn't mean broken. It means in transition. That idea helped me stay, not passively, but intentionally. Instead of reacting to every moment of discomfort, I started observing, listening more carefully, not just to words, but to patterns, to effort, to intention, because real connection isn't built on perfect moments. It's built on consistent ones. And even in the distance, there were signs, small ones, easy to miss if you're focused only on what's wrong, but they were there, moments of trying, moments of openness, moments that said, this isn't over. And that gave me something I didn't have before. Not certainty, but possibility. And sometimes that's enough to keep going. But here's where the story takes another turn. Because doubt doesn't disappear just because you understand it. It waits. It tests you. It asks one more question. Are you willing to keep risking? Even without guarantees? And that question? That's where everything changes again. Because the next step I had to take wasn't about communication anymore. It was about choice. A real one. Clear. Unavoidable. And once I made it, there was no going back. the turning point. There's a moment in life when thinking stops helping. You've analyzed everything. You've replayed conversations. You've imagined every possible outcome, good, bad, and everything in between. And yet you're still in the same place, stuck between staying safe and risking change. That's the illusion of overthinking. It feels productive. It feels responsible. But at some point, it becomes a loop, one that keeps you from doing the only thing that actually moves your life forward. Choosing. Not perfectly. Not confidently. Just choosing. That moment came for me on a day that didn't feel special at all. No big event. No dramatic buildup. Just a quiet realization that had been growing in the background for weeks, maybe months. I can't stay in between anymore. Because that's where I had been living. Not fully honest. Not fully silent. Not fully connected. Not fully disconnected.
Just in between.
And the problem with in between is that it slowly drains you. You're constantly adjusting, constantly thinking, constantly holding back just enough to avoid discomfort, but never enough to feel free. It's exhausting. And eventually, your mind and your body start asking the same question. How long are you going to live like this? That question? It doesn't go away. It gets louder. Until one day you can't ignore it anymore. For me, that day looked simple from the outside. But inside, everything was clear. Not easy. Not comfortable. But clear. I remember sitting there, feeling that familiar tension, the kind that comes right before you either retreat or move forward. And for the first time, I didn't ask, what if this goes wrong? I asked something different. What if staying the same is the real risk? That shift, it changes everything. Because suddenly, the safe option doesn't feel safe anymore. It feels limiting. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. There's actually a concept in behavioral science called loss aversion. Humans are wired to avoid loss more than they seek gain. That's why we stay in situations that are okay instead of risking something better. But here's the twist. Your brain defines loss based on what you focus on. If you focus on what you might lose by speaking up, you stay silent. But if you focus on what you're already losing by staying silent, you start to move. And that's exactly what happened to me. I realized I wasn't protecting my life. I was slowly shrinking it. That awareness didn't make the decision easier, but it made it necessary. So I did something I had been avoiding for a long time. I stopped rehearsing, and I started speaking. Not perfectly, not with a carefully planned script, just honestly. I said what I had been holding back. Not everything at once, but enough to be real, enough to matter. And here's the part people don't expect. The moment itself wasn't dramatic.
No shouting.
No big emotional explosion. Just a conversation.
Calm. Direct.
Honest. And yet, it felt like standing on the edge of something unknown. Because when you finally say what's real, you lose control over what happens next. And that's the real fear. Not speaking, but the outcome. Will it bring you closer? Or push you further apart? Will it fix things? Or reveal that they're more broken than you thought? There's no way to know. And that's why most people never take the risk. But I did. And for a moment, everything felt still, like time paused, waiting for a response. And in that space, something interesting happened. I noticed my own reaction. Not fear, not panic, but relief. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying everything inside anymore. I had put it out there.
Real.
Unfiltered. Honest. And that alone, it changed something in me. There's a psychological effect called emotional release. When you express something you've been suppressing, your nervous system literally shifts. The tension decreases. The mental load lightens. In simple terms, you feel free. Not because everything is solved, but because you're no longer hiding from it. And that's exactly what I felt.
Free.
Even before I knew what the outcome would be. That's when I understood something powerful. Taking a risk isn't just about changing your situation. It's about changing your relationship with fear. Before, fear controlled my actions. Now it was just there, present, but not in charge. And that's a completely different experience. Because once fear stops controlling you, you start seeing options instead of obstacles, possibilities instead of problems. And even though I didn't know exactly what would happen next, I knew one thing for sure. I had crossed a line I could never go back from. Not in the relationship. In myself. I was no longer the person who stayed silent to keep things comfortable. I had become someone who was willing to risk discomfort for something real. And that identity shift, it changes everything that comes after. Because now, the story isn't about whether things will go perfectly. It's about whether you're willing to keep showing up honestly, no matter what. And here's where it gets interesting. Because what happened next wasn't what I expected. It wasn't immediate clarity. It wasn't instant resolution. It was something more complex, more real, and, in a strange way, more powerful. Because sometimes when you take a risk, you don't get answers right away. You get space. Space for things to shift, to respond, to evolve. And that space? It's where the next part of the story begins. Learning to speak, learning to feel. Here's something nobody warns you about. When you finally say what's real, you don't just change the conversation, you change the emotional climate of your life. And at first, that new climate feels unfamiliar, like stepping outside and realizing the air is different. Not worse, not better. Just different enough that your body doesn't know how to relax yet. That's where I was after the turning point. I had said what I needed to say. I had taken the risk. I had stepped out of silence. And now, there was space. Not empty space, but open space. And open space can feel uncomfortable. Because before, everything was predictable.
You knew what to say.
You knew what not to say. You knew how to avoid tension.
Now,
you don't. Now, every moment has potential. Potential for connection. But also potential for discomfort. And that's where the real learning begins. Not just learning to speak, but learning to feel what happens after you speak. Because here's the truth. Communication doesn't end when the words come out. That's just the beginning. What comes next is what most people aren't prepared for. The reactions, the pauses, the subtle shifts in energy, the moments where you wonder, did that help or make things harder? And your instinct is to go back to control, to explain more, to fix, to adjust, to make sure everything lands perfectly. But here's the shift I had to learn, slowly and honestly, a bit painfully. You can't control connection. You can only participate in it. That realization changed how I approached everything. Instead of trying to manage every conversation, I started allowing them to unfold. Naturally, messily, honestly. And something surprising started happening. The more I stopped trying to perform communication, the more real it became. There were moments of silence, but they didn't feel empty anymore. There were pauses, but they didn't feel like failure. They felt like processing. Like something real was happening underneath the surface. And that's when I understood something important about communication in the U.S. Especially in close relationships. Not everything needs to be filled with words. Sometimes, presence is more powerful than explanation. That was new for me, because before, silence meant distance. Now, it started to mean space. And space, when it's safe, allows growth. But let's not pretend it was all smooth. Because alongside those moments of connection, there were still moments of doubt. Moments where I felt exposed. Moments where I questioned if I was doing the right thing. That's the part people don't show in success stories. The in-between phase, where nothing is clearly broken, but nothing is fully resolved either. And in that phase, your emotions can feel amplified. You notice more. You feel more. You react more. Because you're no longer numb. You're awake. And being awake, it's not always comfortable, but it's necessary. There's a concept in emotional psychology called emotional granularity. It means your ability to recognize and differentiate your feelings. The more you express yourself honestly, the more emotionally aware you become. And that's exactly what was happening to me. Before, everything was simple.
Fine.
Okay. Tired. Now, there were layers. I feel a little disconnected, but also hopeful. I feel unsure, but not afraid. I feel uncomfortable, but also more real than before. That level of awareness, it changes how you experience everything. Because now, you're not just reacting. You're understanding. And understanding creates choice. Choice in how you respond. Choice in how you continue. Choice in whether you move forward or go back. And here's the key. Once you've experienced this level of awareness, going back to numbness doesn't feel like peace anymore. It feels like loss. So, even when things felt uncertain, I kept going. Not perfectly, but intentionally. I kept speaking. I kept listening. I kept allowing moments to be what they were without rushing to fix them. And slowly, something started to shift. Not in a big, obvious way, but in a quiet, consistent one. Conversations became more natural. Reactions became more open. Moments of connection started lasting longer. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real.
And real change?
It doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. There was one moment I remember clearly. A simple exchange. A normal day. But something about it felt different. Lighter. Easier. More connected. And I realized something in that moment. This isn't about speaking perfect English. This isn't about saying the right thing every time. This is about being present enough to mean what you say. Because when your words match your feelings, people feel it. Even if your grammar isn't perfect. Even if your sentence isn't complete. Even if you pause. Connection isn't built on perfection. It's built on authenticity. And that's what I was finally starting to experience. Not all the time, but enough to know I was moving in the right direction. And here's the part that changed everything for me. I stopped seeing communication as something I had to get right and started seeing it as something I could grow into. That shift, it removes pressure. It creates space. It allows you to improve, not through force, but through experience. And that's exactly what was happening. Little by little, moment by moment. I was learning something deeper than language. I was learning how to show up fully, honestly,
Consistently.
and as that started to stabilize, something else began to emerge. Something bigger. Because when two people both start showing up differently, the relationship itself begins to change. Not instantly, but inevitably. And that's where the next chapter begins. Because now it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about us. About what we could rebuild together. Rebuilding together. Here's the part nobody can guarantee. No book, no advice, no perfect communication strategy can promise you this. What happens after you both start trying? Because one person changing is powerful, but two people changing at the same time? That's unpredictable. It can create something stronger, or expose everything that doesn't fit anymore. And that's exactly where we were. Somewhere in between what we used to be and what we were becoming. After everything I told you, the honesty, the risk, the uncomfortable space, something subtle began to shift. Not instantly. Not in a way that made you say, wow, everything is fixed. But in a way that made you pause and think, wait, this feels different. And difference, when it's real, doesn't need to announce itself. You feel it in the tone of a voice, in the way someone listens, in the moments that used to pass quietly but now hold just a little more attention. That's how rebuilding starts. Not with big promises, but with small consistency. There's a concept in relationship psychology called repair attempts. These are small actions people take to reconnect after tension or distance, like asking a follow-up question, making eye contact, or even just staying present instead of withdrawing. And here's what most people don't realize. Successful relationships aren't the ones without problems. They're the ones where repair attempts actually happen and are received. That's what started changing for us. Not perfectly, but noticeably. I remember one moment that felt almost ordinary, and yet it stayed with me. We were talking about something small, nothing emotional, nothing deep, just a normal conversation. But this time something shifted. There was more listening, less interruption, more curiosity, less assumption. And suddenly, the conversation didn't end where it usually did. It continued, naturally, easily. And I caught myself thinking, when did this become possible again? That's the thing about rebuilding. You don't always see it happening in real time. You notice it in hindsight, in moments that feel slightly easier than before, slightly warmer, slightly more connected. But let's be real for a second. Rebuilding isn't a straight path. There were still moments of tension, still misunderstandings, still days where things felt unclear. Because when you change the foundation of a relationship, everything above it has to adjust.
And adjustment takes time.
There's a psychological principle called neural rewiring. When you change behaviors and emotional responses, your brain literally forms new pathways, but those pathways need repetition to become stable. In simple terms, you don't rebuild trust in one conversation. You rebuild it in patterns. And patterns take time. That's why patience became just as important as honesty. Because without patience, every small setback feels like failure. But with patience, you start seeing progress where you used to see problems. I started noticing something else too, something I didn't expect. The more I stayed consistent in how I showed up, the more the energy between us changed. Not because I forced it, but because consistency creates safety. And safety allows people to open up. That's when something deeper started happening. Conversations that used to stay on the surface started going just a little deeper. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to feel real. There were moments of sharing, moments of understanding, moments where I felt like I wasn't the only one trying anymore. And that's a powerful shift. Because rebuilding alone feels exhausting. But rebuilding together? That feels possible. There was one evening I remember clearly. No special occasion. No big event. Just a quiet moment where we were talking, and suddenly something clicked. Not perfectly, but genuinely. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while.
Ease.
Not forced. Not fragile. Just natural. And in that moment, I realized something important. This isn't about going back to how things were. It's about creating something new. Because what we had before, it worked, but it wasn't complete. And now we had the chance to build something more honest, more aware, more intentional. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because rebuilding doesn't just change the relationship. It changes the expectations. Before, I wanted things to feel easy.
Now,
I wanted them to feel real. And real comes with complexity, with effort, with moments that aren't perfect, but are meaningful. That shift in expectation, it changes how you experience everything. You stop looking for perfection and start appreciating progress. You stop fearing discomfort and start understanding it. And most importantly, you stop asking, is this working perfectly? And start asking, are we both showing up? And if the answer is yes, that's enough to keep going. But here's the truth most people don't say out loud. Even when things start improving, there's still a quiet fear in the background. A question that doesn't fully disappear. Will this last? Because once you've experienced distance, you know it can come back. And that awareness? It keeps you alert. Not in a negative way, but in a real one. It reminds you that connection isn't something you achieve once. It's something you maintain every day through small choices, through consistent presence, through continued honesty. And that's exactly what we were learning together. Not perfectly, but intentionally. And as that foundation became stronger, something else started to grow. Something beyond just the relationship itself. A sense of stability, of shared direction, of building something that wasn't just about surviving, but about living. And that's where the next chapter begins. Because rebuilding a relationship is one thing. Building a life together? That's a whole new level. Family, culture, and balance. Here's something no one really explains when they talk about relationships in the United States. Love is one thing. Building a life together? That's something else entirely. Because love can feel strong even in moments of distance. It can survive silence, confusion, even doubt. But building a life, that's daily. Practical. Sometimes messy. It's where emotions meet reality. And reality doesn't always follow your expectations. After everything we had been through, the distance, the honesty, the rebuilding, you might think this is where the story becomes smooth, easier, predictable. But the truth? This is where a different kind of challenge begins. Because now, it's not just about us in conversations. It's about us in life, in routines, in responsibilities, in decisions that don't just affect feelings, but shape the future. And when you're living in the U.S., there's an added layer that quietly influences everything. Culture. Not in obvious ways, but in subtle, everyday expectations. Independence. Personal space. Time management. Work-life balance. Communication styles. They all sound simple, until you realize you might not interpret them the same way. That's where balance becomes essential. I started noticing it in small things first. Schedules. In the U.S., time is structured, planned, efficient. People value productivity. You don't just see what happens. You organize, you plan, you commit. At first, that felt helpful, clear. But over time, I realized something deeper. When everything is scheduled, where does spontaneity go? Where do those unplanned moments of connection live? That question stayed in my mind longer than I expected. Because relationships don't grow in perfectly planned time slots. They grow in presence. And presence doesn't always follow a calendar. Then there was personal space. In American culture, space is respect. Giving someone time alone isn't distance, it's understanding. But here's the catch. If you're not used to that, space can feel like disconnection. And that difference? It creates quiet confusion. I remember moments where I wondered, are we okay? Not because something was wrong, but because the way closeness was expressed felt different. And that's the thing about cultural differences, they don't always create conflict. They create interpretation gaps. Same situation, different meaning. That's where awareness became everything. Instead of reacting emotionally, I started asking, what does this mean from their perspective? That simple question changed how I saw things. Because suddenly, behaviors that felt distant started to make sense. Not always comfortable, but understandable. And understanding creates patience. Now, let's talk about something even more real, daily life pressure. Because love doesn't exist in isolation. It exists alongside work stress, responsibilities, expectations, and sometimes exhaustion. And in the U.S., where life moves fast, where people are constantly balancing multiple roles, it's easy for relationships to become functional. You communicate to manage life, not to connect. And if you're not careful, that becomes the default.
We had moments like that.
Days where conversations were about tasks, schedules, plans. Necessary, but not emotional. And that's where balance became a conscious choice. Not something that happens automatically. Something you create. I started realizing that connection doesn't just happen because you care about someone. It happens because you make space for it. Intentionally. Even when life is busy. Even when you're tired. Even when it would be easier to just get through the day. There's actually research in relationship science that supports this. Studies show that couples who intentionally create small moments of connection, like short daily check-ins or shared routines, maintain stronger emotional bonds over time. Not because they have more time, but because they use it differently. That insight changed how I approach things. I stopped waiting for the right moment to connect and started creating small ones. A simple question, a shared moment, a little more attention than usual, and slowly, that started to shape the atmosphere of our daily life. Not dramatically, but consistently. There was one moment that made this clear for me. It was a regular day. Nothing special. No big event. But instead of moving through it automatically, something felt intentional. We were present, engaged, not distracted by everything else. And I realized something. Balance isn't about splitting everything evenly. It's about aligning what matters. Because in real life, things will always be busy. Schedules will always exist. Responsibilities won't disappear. But connection? That's the part you choose. And that choice, it changes everything. But here's the deeper layer I didn't expect. As we started building this balance, something else started to grow. A sense of stability. Not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from knowing we're figuring this out together. And that feeling? It creates something powerful. Because when you know you're not alone in the process, challenges feel manageable. Not easy, but possible. And that's the shift from just being in a relationship to actually building a life together. But let's be honest for a moment. Even with all this progress, all this awareness, all this effort, there's still one question that quietly lingers. Is this enough? Because building a life isn't just about stability. It's about growth, about meaning, about becoming something more than you were before. And that question? It doesn't disappear. It evolves. Because once your life feels stable, you start asking something deeper. Am I truly becoming who I want to be? And that question? That's where the next chapter begins. Not about the relationship, but about something even more personal. What really changed inside me? What really changed me? Let me tell you something that might sound surprising after everything you've heard so far. The biggest change in my life wasn't my relationship. It wasn't communication. It wasn't even the risk I took. It was something much quieter. Something internal. Something that most people will never see, but it affects everything you do. It was the moment I stopped asking, what if this goes wrong? And started asking, what if I can handle whatever happens? That shift? It's subtle, but it changes the entire way you experience life. Because before that, everything I did was filtered through fear. Not obvious fear. Not dramatic fear. but quiet, logical, socially acceptable fear. Fear of making things worse. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of losing something that looked stable. And here's the tricky part. Those fears don't feel irrational. They feel responsible, mature, careful. But when you look closer, there's still fear. And fear, no matter how logical it sounds, has one goal: to keep you where you are. Safe, predictable, unchanged. The problem? Growth doesn't happen there. It can't, because growth requires movement. And movement always involves uncertainty. That's what I finally understood. Not intellectually, but experientially. Because when I took that risk, when I spoke honestly, when I stayed present, when I didn't retreat even when things felt uncomfortable, I realized something powerful. I didn't break. Nothing collapsed. Life didn't fall apart. Instead, I adapted. And that realization? It's life-changing. There's a concept in psychology called self-efficacy. It's your belief in your ability to handle challenges. Not avoid them. Not control them.
Handle them.
And studies show that this belief is one of the strongest predictors of long-term success, resilience, and emotional well-being. In simple terms, it's not about having a perfect life. It's about trusting yourself inside whatever life gives you. That's what changed for me. Before, I needed certainty to feel okay. Now, I could tolerate uncertainty. And that makes you stronger in ways that are hard to explain until you experience it. Because suddenly, you're not constantly trying to predict every outcome. You're not stuck in endless what-if scenarios. You're not waiting for the perfect moment to act. You just move. Not recklessly. Not blindly. But with a quiet confidence that says, I'll figure it out. And that confidence? It doesn't come from success. It comes from facing discomfort and realizing you survived it. That's what most people miss. They think confidence comes first. But actually it comes after. After the risk. After the uncertainty. After the moment where you thought, I don't know if I can do this, and then you did. Even imperfectly. Even messily. Even with doubt. That's enough. And once you experience that, something shifts permanently. You stop seeing challenges as threats and start seeing them as part of the process. Now here's where it connects back to everything else. Because this internal shift didn't just stay inside me. It changed how I showed up everywhere. In conversations, in decisions, in daily life. I became less reactive, less controlled by fear, more present, more willing to engage, even when things weren't perfect. And that had a ripple effect. Because when one person changes at that level, everything around them responds. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually, consistently, naturally. There was a moment I remember clearly. Nothing special, just a normal interaction. But something felt different, lighter, more natural. And I realized, it wasn't the situation that changed. It was me. I wasn't overthinking every word. I wasn't analyzing every reaction. I wasn't trying to control the outcome. I was just there, present. And that presence, it creates a completely different energy. Because people don't just respond to your words. They respond to your state. And when your state is calm, open, and grounded, communication becomes easier. Connection becomes natural. Even challenges feel manageable. That's when I understood something deeper. The real transformation wasn't learning how to speak better. It was learning how to be okay even when things aren't perfect. Because perfection isn't real, but presence is. And presence is enough. Now, let's bring this back to you. Because maybe you're watching this and thinking, I get it, but it still feels hard. Of course it does. It's supposed to. Anything meaningful in life, growth, connection, change, it always comes with discomfort. But here's the difference. Discomfort doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're doing something new. And new is where possibility lives. So, if you're in a place right now where things feel fine but not fulfilling, if you're holding back what you really want to say, if you're waiting for the perfect moment to take a step forward, let me tell you this, based on everything I've experienced, the perfect moment doesn't come. Clarity doesn't come first. Confidence doesn't come first. Action comes first.
Small.
Imperfect, but real. And from that action, everything else grows. That's what changed me. Not the outcome, not the situation, but the decision to stop waiting and start moving. And once you make that decision, you start seeing your life differently. Not as something you react to, but as something you shape. And that realization, it leads to one final question. A simple one, but a powerful one. Because everything you've heard so far, all the risk, all the growth, all the change, it all comes down to this. What are you going to do next? Would you risk it? Let me ask you something, and I don't want you to answer it quickly. I want you to actually feel it. If your life looks fine right now, but something inside you feels incomplete, disconnected, or quietly unsatisfied, would you risk changing it? Not in a dramatic, movie-like way. Not by walking away from everything, but by doing something much harder. Telling the truth. Fully. Honestly. Without knowing exactly what will happen next. Because that's what this entire story comes down to. Not the relationship. Not the culture. Not even the journey of learning how to speak or express. It comes down to one decision. Do you stay where it's safe? Or do you move toward what's real? And here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Those two things are rarely the same. Safety feels good in the moment. It protects you from conflict, from rejection, from uncertainty. But over time, it slowly disconnects you from yourself, from what you actually feel, from what you actually want, from the life you could be living. And the scariest part? You might not even notice it happening, because it's gradual, quiet, comfortable, until one day you wake up and realize you've been living a version of your life that looks right, but doesn't feel right. That's where I was. And if I'm being completely honest with you, the hardest part wasn't taking the risk. It was admitting that I needed to. Because once you admit that, you can't go back to pretending everything is okay. You see things differently. You feel things more clearly. And that clarity, it demands action. Even if that action is small. Even if it's just one sentence. One honest moment. One step outside your usual pattern. That's how it started for me. Not with confidence. Not with certainty. But with a simple decision. I can't keep living like this. And from that moment, everything began to change. Not instantly. Not perfectly. But meaningfully. I started speaking more honestly. I started showing up more fully. I started accepting discomfort as part of growth, not something to avoid. And slowly, my life started to feel different. Not easier, but more real. And that made everything worth it. Because at the end of the day, that's what most people are actually searching for. Not perfection. Not constant happiness. But meaning. Connection. A sense that their life belongs to them. And here's the part one want you to really understand. Taking a risk doesn't guarantee a perfect outcome. It doesn't promise that everything will work out exactly the way you want. But it does guarantee one thing. You will grow. You will learn. You will become someone who can face life more honestly, more openly, more fully. And that's something no outcome can take away from you. There's a study in psychology that shows people regret the things they didn't do far more than the things they did, even if those actions didn't lead to success. Why? Because action creates clarity. Inaction creates doubt. And doubt stays with you. It lingers. It whispers, what if, long after the moment has passed? That's the real cost of staying safe. Not failure, but wondering. And wondering, it never really leaves. So when you think about your own life, your relationships, your choices, your voice, ask yourself this. What am I avoiding right now? Not in a judgmental way, not in a critical way,
but in an honest way.
Because whatever your answer is, that's where your next step is. It might be small. It might feel uncomfortable. It might not change everything overnight, but it matters more than you think. Because every time you choose honesty over avoidance, you move closer to a life that actually feels like yours. And that's the whole point. Now, let me bring this back to where we started. I took the risk, not because I was brave, not because I had everything figured out, but because I reached a point where staying the same felt more painful than changing. And that's something you don't need to rush. But you do need to recognize. Because when that moment comes for you, you'll know. It won't feel perfect. It won't feel comfortable. But it will feel clear. And in that moment, you'll have a choice. The same one I had. Stay where you are. Or take the risk. So I'll ask you one more time. Not as a challenge. Not as pressure. But as an invitation. Would you risk it? Because your answer, it doesn't just shape your next step. It shapes your entire life. And maybe, just maybe, the life you're waiting for isn't on the other side of certainty. It's on the other side of one honest moment. What if the moment you've been avoiding is actually the one that changes everything? Not tomorrow. Not when you feel ready. But right now, when things are unclear, uncomfortable, and real. Because the truth is, most people don't fail because they make the wrong choice. They stay stuck because they never choose at all. I took the risk. Not perfectly, not confidently, but honestly. And that honesty didn't just change my relationship. It gave me my voice back, my clarity back, my life back. So here's the real question, one that might stay with you long after this video ends. Are you waiting for certainty, or are you ready for change? If this story made you pause, think, or feel something real, don't ignore that. That's your moment. Like this video if you've ever felt stuck but still hopeful. Subscribe for more real English story practice and powerful life stories that help you grow while learning naturally. A comment below. Would you risk it? Why or why not? Because sometimes one honest answer is all it takes to begin again.